It is a pleasure to be here. As you mentioned, I'm going to hit on this cost-benefit study from the cost angle. Obviously, it was a major project, and this is an opportunity maybe to at least shed a little bit of light on what our thinking was and some of our results. Obviously, the report's been out for a while now, so I'm sure you've had a chance to see it. Just as he mentioned, I'm just one of a fairly large team. This is a fairly big team across multiple states, multiple universities. Myself and Chris Crosby up there, we were the ones that spent most of the time working on the cost. So it's a big team, but if you have criticisms at the cost side, you address them to me, because we were the ones that took the lead on the cost side. Just real quick, what our objectives were with this study. We wanted to estimate annual costs for the major livestock species, at least those that we were going to focus on, and the obvious ones: beef and dairy, swine, sheep, poultry, and equine. I'm not going to talk about equine today. It takes a whole other 2 hours probably. But the other thing we wanted to do was to look at how the costs vary across the different production sectors, and I'll show you some examples on that in a minute. And then the other one that we knew we had to address was how do costs vary by operation size, because as we start talking to people and hearing from listening groups, listening sessions, that was a concern, and we said we knew we had to address that. Specifically, we had three approaches, or three scenarios, if you want, that we were going to focus on. What's the cost if we just did premises registration? What's the cost if we have kind of a bookend type approach where we ID animals at birth and then again at termination? And then the last one being the full traceability, where we're trying to actually track movement as well. Then the other thing we did for the cost-benefit study, and specifically for the benefits, is we looked at how the cost might vary by level of adoption. 30% of the industry has adoption, 50, 70, 90%. So I'll report some of those results on the cost side. Just to let you know, though, there's no way in 25, 30 minutes we can even remotely get at all the details. If you go to the full report, it's over 400 pages long, and probably 150 of it is devoted to costs. Now, I point that out just because there's a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of methods and whatnot. There's no way we can get into all the details today. My attempt here is to kind of say this is what we did very broadly, and here's some results. I said a lot of details behind it. It's posted on APHIS website as well as ours at K-State there. So what we looked at is the different species, and beef and dairy. We specifically said let's try to break it out: beef, cow, calf operations, dairy operations. In dairy operations, we don't have data to say heifer raising versus dairies, that are milking. So all dairies together. Backgrounding operations, or people running stocker operations, feedlots, and then we also have the sale barns and the packers. Now, we assumed that the technology we used in our analysis was RFID technology, individual animal ID. Now, we were charged with, we should evaluate all these different things. Well, as we went around to listening sessions, we very rapidly heard, we have to have a system. So we said, rather than trying to develop cost estimates for 20 different types of technologies, we're going to use one. So that's what we used. That's somewhat been the one that's kind of the standard, but that's what we used. The cow, calf, and dairy operations we then broke into two groups. We said those people that are currently identifying their animals on an individual basis, i.e. those that are currently tagging their calves, and those that aren't. And we could use NOMS data to say what percent of the herds in the U.S. are currently identifying their calves versus those that aren't. Okay, because we know they'll have different costs. Backgrounders and feedlots, we basically just one group, in different sizes. The different sizes, just to we use NAS data. And just as a quick background, we tried to use publicly reported information as much as possible. NAS data from NOMS, different surveys, GIPSA. So therefore people could go back and see exactly where our numbers came from. Now obviously on some things we had to make assumptions and there wasn't publicly reported data. But you can see that I've got two cow-calf kind of operation types, those that tag, those that don't, and I've got 7 different sizes. So that's 14 budgets if you want. 14 budgets for dairy, 7 budgets for backgrounders, 9 budgets. So there's a total of 44 different budgets if you want that are representative of a type of operation, a size of cow-calf operations that currently tag, a size of dairy operations that currently don't tag. Okay, so 44 different budgets that were representative of a certain group of producers. With regards to auction markets and packers, all I'll say real quick is we relied on a couple other studies that had collected cost data on those. Okay, so we used results from that to then estimate some costs, and then we brought in distributions of number of of livestock markets and size and whatnot, and same for packers. So we were relying on some other studies, and then we made some estimates from that. Just real quick, the budgets. Okay, I'm going to spend more time on beef and dairy than I'll jump with the other species. I'll mostly just show results. We broke all the costs into three main categories, what we call tagging-related costs. That's tags, tag applicators, getting the tag in their ear, i.e. labor, shoots, if I have to restrain an animal, shrink to animal, injury to animals and people. So those were the tags and tag-related costs. The main one that we're going to, that drives a lot of that is the tag cost. So this is just to show you what our assumptions were. We basically said, if you're buying one tag, you're going to spend $2.60. If you're buying a lot of tags, you're going to buy $2. So as your operation varied in size, you were assigned a different cost of tag. Because as we went out and looked at people where, what tags cost, so we factor that in. We also, in the report, we talk about what the cost of tags has done over time, and we clearly see that over time it's dropped. So if anything, we think in today's terms these numbers are too high, but back in 2007 that was kind of the current price. In addition to getting that tag, in the case of beef and dairy, into their ear, we had reading costs, i.e. if I've got an electronic tag in their ear, I've got to read it some way. Well, that's going to be, do I have to spend money on wands and things like that? Do I have labor involved? Things of that nature. Real quick on that, what we did is we basically said if you buy a wand or a panel, you've got depreciation, interest, things like that. You might have storage cost, data storage cost, software, etc. On the other hand, if you're a small enough operation, reading a few enough tags, you're probably not going to buy this technology. You're going to hire it done. Now, we don't have a lot of people out there today that have custom reading services. So what we did is we went and collected data on brand reporting states and said, what does it cost to get, for brand inspections? And we said, we're going to use that as a proxy of what someone might charge to go out and basically read cattle. Okay? And what we did was we come up with a range of 85 cents to $3 a head based on these different states' information we collected. Once again, economies of size related. If you had someone come out and read 500 head, that's way different than if they came out and read 5 head. And then in the budget, what we said is it'll be the minimum. It's either the lower of custom hire, or buying a panel, or buying a handheld, whatever's the cheapest, lowest cost. Okay, so that's how the budget was all set up. And then the last cost we had was premises registration. And while we hear, we all say there's no charge for the most part, we said we are going to put in a charge to reflect management time of making that decision. And the number we used is we said it costs $20 the first year you do it, and every 3 years you might renew. And I think we did that because that was fairly consistent with what California was doing. So we come up with an annualized cost of $5 per operation, or $4.64. Not a big number, but it's a number we put in there. Okay, so a lot of numbers on here, and I'll just point out a few that are the more important ones. This is the total cost of the beef and dairy sector. So across the beef and dairy sector, it's about $209 million total for everything. And that includes running them through the auction markets, the packers, and whatnot. Is that a big number? Well, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. I mean, 210 million, 209 million is a big number in one sense, but in perspective, it might not be that big. It is $6 per head marketed. So if we slaughter roughly 35 million cattle a year, fed steers, heifers, bulls, cows, it's about $6 per head. Okay, so putting it in that context. If we look at what we spend the money on, the cow operations, dairies and beef, they're going to spend most of the costs on the tags and tagging related costs. It's because they put that tag in the ear. Background and feedlot, they're going to spend much more on reading. That's because if this system was in place and working the way it's supposed to, they would come to the feedlot with a tag already in their ear. The only time they buy a tag is if it loses it. Okay, so most of their cost is associated with reading. So the different sectors spend money on different kinds of things. Shouldn't really surprise us. Now, this is the cow-calf. Clearly, there's economies of size. I said, the smallest operations that don't tag, over $7. Those that currently are tagging, the largest operations, under $3, just barely. So we're talking about almost $5 difference, $4.50 to $5 difference. Is that a big number? Well, $4.50 to $5 on average in the beef cow-calf operation is a big number. It is a big number. On the other hand, the thing we have to realize is there's probably not a single cost, labor, feed, equipment, you name it, that the small operations don't have a huge disadvantage than the large operations. I mean, we see that in our data all the time. So when we see this difference, I don't want to minimize it and say it's not important. It is important. But I just also want to say that's not anything that we would not, we would expect it. It's the same way for everything. But the point is that's not $60 versus $5. That's $7.17 versus $2.50. Those are, I think, much more appropriate numbers if we had an animal ID system where we were required to put tags in your ears and that not. Because I'm not buying computers and readers and software if I only got a few head. Okay, so these are the much more relevant numbers. And this is actually fairly consistent with the spreadsheet if you make the right assumptions. Dairy, similar kind of thing. Economies of size exist. Stocker operations, economies of size exist. Obviously, the costs are much lower, down there around 60 cents a head. Feedlot, down around 30 cents a head. Economies of size exist. There's no reason to ever expect that we'd find otherwise. Smaller operations have a fixed cost, essentially, and if they don't use that cost across more head, their cost per head will be higher. A lot of numbers on here, and like I said, the only point of this is we do know, and at the very bottom, you probably can't see it, it's the bottom number is $5.97. So that's the same number I showed earlier, $6 per head roughly if we had the entire industry, full traceability, 100% adoption. You can see that if we only had 50% adoption, the cost is not just half of that. Basically, the less adoption we have, the lower the cost per head, but that's because we assume that the low-cost people will adopt first. And this gets to some of the things we talked about yesterday, though, that if we really want to have an effective system, we might have to get up there to 80 to 90% adoption. If we have lower adoption, the costs are much lower per head because the more efficient, lower-cost people adopt it. But like I said, we also don't get near the traceability and potential benefits. So that's just kind of real quick, what we'd also expect is the early adopters would be those folks with low costs. Hogs, we broke it into, or swine, we broke into farrow to wean, farrow to feeder, and then the finishing operations. Same thing, we had some packer data that we relied on from another study. The big difference with hogs is we obviously assumed group lot ID for market hogs. So that's a major change compared to beef, group lot ID. And then we said an individual ID, but a visual tag, not an electronic tag for cull breeding stock. Okay, so that was the assumptions we made. Once again, we used government data as much as possible. The one thing we did with swine and poultry, it really comes in, is we worked off number of operations as reported by USDA NAS. We know that there's some problems with that because of the integration. And we also know that maybe we should be working with sites as opposed to operations. We don't have information on the number of sites around the country. We have the number of operations. So are they problems? Yeah, they're potential problems, but not what I would contend to be a major issue that drastically changes our costs. But just we point that out. For the group lot ID, I said that was pretty straightforward. On the individual hogs, one of the things we did in working with some people is they said anybody that's probably running over 200 sows routinely is already tagging their sows anyway. This is what we got from some industry experts. And so they said the cost is going to be at some marginal cost. It'll be a little bit more expensive for this premises ID kind of tag. Those that currently aren't tagging, and so we use the rule of less than 200 sows, their costs would be higher. So once again, there was some built-in diseconomies of size, or economies of size if you want. The cost per lot for reporting a lot, that one is very difficult to know exactly how to handle that. And we would contend that we were conservative on the high end. Basically what we said is we calculated cost of having a bar tag, printing off labels, and a bunch of readers, or we said it'll be a certain amount of labor that just does it. And bottom line is if the cost of buying all the readers and barcode stuff was more than $7.39, we just used labor. We said somebody would just get on the phone, call in, and say, here's the number. And we think even that's probably too high a number. They could do it for less. Okay, just to point out, $6 million for hogs compared to $209 million for beef and dairy. Huge difference. But that's because we got a completely different type of technology we're using. We're using group lot on market hogs, and we're using a visual tag. Where are most of the costs? Most of the costs are in reading, by definition. We aren't buying a bunch of tags. We're buying a few tags for the breeding stock. So most of the costs for them is reading, recording, reporting, whatnot. On a per head basis, 6 cents per head. So much different than the $6 per head for the beef and dairy. Okay, so swine obviously have a much lower cost. Economies of size exist. They come in very rapidly. as we would expect. So the numbers are all much lower, but they're even much lower for the large operations. And as before, if we only had 50% adoption, the cost per pig of those 50% would be much lower because, once again, the low-cost people would come in first. That shouldn't really surprise us. The other two sectors, I'm going to just kind of, we lump them together, I mean, in a sense that, and just to be honest, we spent most all of our time with beef and dairy. I mean, that's where, by far and away we spent most of our time. Sheep, we broke it into just one producer group, those that have sheep and lambs, because we don't have data saying this is a lamb finishing operation, i.e. a feedlot versus a ewe operation. So we just lumped all operations together. And then we had packers, once again, some data from the other group. In terms of what we used, basically followed swine in the sense that we used group lot ID for market lambs and then individual ID for breeding stock or culls. Okay, so in that sense, our assumptions and our methods were basically mirrored swine in the approach we used. The costs weren't identical, but we used the same approach. Poultry was layers, broilers, and turkeys, and everything was group lot ID. Okay, and like I said, they're very similar to what we did for swine for both of these. Just to kind of put it in perspective, the sheep sector, about $3.5 million cost. So less than swine, but on a per head basis, considerably higher. And that's because we are tagging proportionately way more of the animals, because one ewe doesn't have 20 pigs like a sow does. So, a higher percent of it's tagging, still have the reading, and like I said, $1.39, which is a fairly substantial cost. $6 for beef, 6 cents for swine, $1.40 per lamb. Same thing, if we only needed 50% adoption, the cost per head would be lower because we'd bring in the low-cost people first, but once again, that's what we've heard over and over. Poultry, basically the only cost we put in was the cost of recording and reporting lots, and we know that our cost estimates are too high. And the reason is because of the massive integration in that system. I.e., if I'm an integrator and I work with 30 contractors, I'll probably do all the reporting. All those 30 won't do it. I'll consolidate it all out of my office. So we basically base it on operations. And if to the extent operations reflect contract growers, they likely wouldn't have the cost of reporting whoever they're working with. The integrator would. So we know that we probably estimate costs too high for poultry. But once again, we always felt if we were going to err, we're going to err on the high side. That was just kind of a direction Chris and I went right from the beginning. So if we kind of just summarize all the costs, and everything I showed you for the most part was full traceability. If we just had a bookend cost, the costs aren't a lot lower for beef and dairy. And that's because, remember, beef and dairy, most all the cost is tagging and tag-related costs. And if we have a bookend system, we still have to do the same thing. The cow-calf operation's not doing a lot of reading. The dairy operation's doing a little more reading. But the beef cow-calf's not doing a lot of reading. So their costs are fairly similar. But on a per-cow basis, so if someone said, I'm running 300 stock cows, they're going to figure about $4.22 per head. I said, that's lower than the number I said earlier because this is on a per cow as opposed to per head marketed. No question the costs are lower in the feedlot and the backgrounding. That's because they don't have the tag cost. Obviously, swine is a lot lower because they can use a different technology. They're using group lot. They aren't buying the individual animal tag. Sheep, I said, in terms of value, they're probably actually higher than beef. And then poultry, very low cost. And even our numbers, I think, are actually too high. So just kind of to try to wrap it up a little bit here. When we think about how do I cover all those costs? If it's $6 for beef, 6 cents for swine, whatever. Well, one is, and there's going to be some talk on this later in the day, but to the extent that the market can get a higher price because of exports or whatever, we all benefit. The problem to the individual producers, they don't see that. We all get a higher price today because the Korea market's open. But we don't see how that helped me. It's not near as transparent. And everybody gets that. So then we have this free rider problem that we've all talked about, is that, well, you guys all do it, and I'm not going to incur the cost because then I get the higher price too. So that's one of the benefits. The other one is if I adopt the technology, I'm going to get a very producer-specific benefit. I'm going to manage my operation better. Okay. Now, we sure don't need a mandatory program for that because if that benefit's there, I should do it anyway. But the fact that only about half of our beef producers currently ID their animals says they aren't feeling that benefit's there. And then there's also the other ones that say, hey, if you're doing some of this value-added, whatnot, I can get some premiums. So we've got some people saying, don't make it mandatory because I'm currently getting some of those premiums, and if it's mandatory, other people will get some of them. So there's these benefits that everyone gets versus those that I get individually. And that's how we're going to capture back the costs at the producer level. So, just to wrap it up, economies of size exist. We knew that going in. We knew that we would have to find that. I mean, there's just no costs, specifically thinking about cow-calf on beef. There's no costs that we ever see where their costs are lower for somebody with 10 cows versus someone with 500 cows. Like I said, whether we're talking labor, equipment, feed, you name it. And there's really no reason to expect otherwise here. But it's not near as large as I think we've been led to believe. I would argue the economies of size differences are not near as large. They're captured fairly quick. I don't have to run 1,000 cows to get low cost. I just have to have enough to kind of get down on that curve. Beef and dairy have relatively higher costs, for sure, compared to poultry and swine. Relative to sheep, maybe, sheep also have very high costs, relative to the value and everything. On the other hand, they have the most benefit. Ask a swine producer that's currently selling large lots and say, if you had animal ID and you identified those groups, how would you manage different? And they're going to say, well, I wouldn't manage different because I'm already doing that. Now, a beef cow-calf producer that hadn't been individually identifying their calves might actually have something to gain from a management perspective. So their costs are higher, but the potential private benefits to their operation are also higher. Producers are very reluctant to adopt because of some of the things we heard about yesterday. The concern about confidentiality. That has nothing to do with our study, but we heard that a lot in our listening sessions. And we heard it yesterday, and it's not going away. I mean, it's always out there. They're not sure about what technology is going to prevail. That's another thing we heard in our listening sessions. We analyze specific technologies, and someone say, it could be something different. And then the big one, though, I still think is that as I talk to especially beef cow-calf producers, they see the increased costs, and they say, but I don't see what benefit I'm going to get. And I said, one of the benefits is market access and things like that, but the other benefits are improved management, and a lot of people don't see that. So they see a higher cost, they don't see the benefits, so they're reluctant. So why are we having some problem getting this adopted? Is because all a lot of people see is cost. Okay.